So welcome back to Tianjin. We're here for the UN climate talks. I'm delighted to be joined by Melita Steele from Greenpeace Africa, and hopefully you're going to shed a little bit of light on South Africa's position at these talks and a couple of the dilemmas and challenges they face. So perhaps a good opening point is to ask, what is the position broadly speaking here?
Well, thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you. South Africa's position in the negotiations is a fairly progressive one. We're pushing for a deal. The climate negotiations are coming to South Africa at the end of next year, so it's really in our interest to try and push things forward. We've also submitted quite an ambitious emission reduction pledge at the end of last year. So we're talking quite a good talk at the moment.
And kind of at these talks, there's kind of generally a divide between the rich countries and poor countries, and obviously most of Africa is not as rich as kind of developed Western countries. South Africa kind of seems to be somewhere in between. Does that leave it in a difficult position in these talks?
It leaves it in an interesting position in these talks because we're not one of the most vulnerable countries, that's for sure, but we are still an African country. And that has created sort of different groupings as well. So South Africa associates with sort of broader developing countries, but there are also sort of emerging economies that we also talk with and have relationships with.
And you've said that South Africa has kind of a fairly progressive attitude here. Why is that? Is it driven by domestic politics, or is it this kind of more an interest in getting an agreement when the talks come to South Africa next year?
I think it's a number of things, but it's not domestic policy that's driving it. In fact, whereas internationally we're quite progressive, domestically there's a lot more that we need to do. I think it's the realization that we need to do more as the world to fight climate change, and also the recognition that developed countries have to take responsibility, and that ambition and action needs to match that.
So you say it's not domestically driven. Is there a big grassroots movement in South Africa campaigning on climate change, or is it mainly kind of a political issue that kind of bounces around among elites, or why has South Africa taken such a lead here?
We don't have a grassroots movement in South Africa on climate change. In fact, it's such a technical issue that in South Africa people don't have enough money to buy food the next day. So getting the issue of climate change onto the agenda is actually pretty tough. I think it's an issue of trade. We have a lot of potential in South Africa, so reducing our emissions can be quite an attractive thing. The president has come out saying that we need to move to a green economy. So it's the sort of, I think it's the moral imperative that's driving it. But domestically, we're still heavily dependent on coal, so that's something we need to change.
Yeah, that's presumably going to pose a challenge because whilst it's kind of laudable that the president can come out and that the leadership are pushing for a kind of greener future, the economy is very reliant on coal and both exporting it and for your own power, and presumably there's a lot of jobs associated with this. So kind of what's the, how do we get through this sticking point?
Well, South Africa is pretty clear that they want to go green. They're not sure how, and they're not sure how much. At the moment, there's one of the largest coal-fired power stations is being built called Medupi, which is 5 gigawatts of electricity, which is massive, one of the biggest in the world. And that's being followed up by a second one of the same magnitude. So the investments in coal are still ongoing. However, we're in planning policy processes which are going to see what our electricity mix should be like in the future, and that will hopefully try and shift South Africa away from coal and towards renewables. But it's a very difficult thing because, as you say, coal is intrinsic to our economy. There are a lot of jobs, a lot of trade. We're one of the biggest exporters of coal. But some of the latest research that Greenpeace Africa has done has actually shown that investing in renewable energy would create more jobs than if we continued along the path that we're using at the moment. 78,000 new jobs by 2030 is what we found, whereas in the coal sector they're actually losing jobs. So it's a matter of priorities. It's a difficult decision to make in the beginning because investing in renewables is expensive in the beginning. So there are a lot of different things at play.
And what is the future? You mentioned jobs associated with renewable energy, and that's certainly been a big theme here. China, leading the way in terms of investment in wind power and other forms of renewables. But is it viable for South Africa to kind of be powered by, I don't know, solar or wind power? If you're building these huge coal-fired power stations, presumably there's a lot of electricity generation happening, and that's a lot of windmills. Is that what kind of Greenpeace is suggesting?
Absolutely. The problem is that coal is seen as something which you need to get your majority of your electricity from. But according to a Greenpeace report called The Energy Revolution, which is basically looking at a complete change in the way that we use and distribute electricity, 75% of our electricity could actually come from renewable energy by 2050, whereas at the moment more than 90% of our electricity comes from coal. So what's technically feasible is that 75%, and that is because we've got some of the best renewable resources in the world. So it's just a case of investing in those, really.
Is there the capacity to achieve that in 5 years, 2015? That would presumably take a massive undertaking to get that shift in towards renewable energy. Is that a kind of an ideal or a realistic aim? What do we think we can achieve in the next kind of 5 to 10 years in South Africa?
Okay, well, the 75% is 2050.
Sorry, 2050. That makes more sense.
That gives a slightly longer time frame. But at the moment, we're reviewing our renewable energy target, and it's 4% by 2014, which is really tiny. So what we're saying is that by 2030, we should be aiming for a minimum of 36%. So, 20% by 2020 is not out of the realm of possibility.
Seems more doable.
Yeah.
And okay, so I guess the question here then is, a final question to bring it back to China. What are the hopes to achieve at the end of this week? The talks we know are going quite slowly so far, and South Africa presumably pushing the agenda. It's keen to see some progress come the next year's Copenhagen equivalent in Joburg. So how are you going to push the agenda forward, and should we be hopeful of a deal when it comes to South Africa in a year's time?
I think we have to be very careful about expectations, because we've learned in the past that very high expectations don't end well. But I think that very low expectations don't end well either. I think that it's clear that we need to be working towards a deal, and an ambitious and fair deal has to be, that's unequivocal. And at the end of this week, I think that there really needs to be some agreement on the things that are close to being agreed. The circles that happen just need to be avoided, and the focus on the key elements really needs to happen, so that when we get to Cancun, we can actually finalize those things and then move forward towards a legally binding deal, towards maybe in South Africa, hopefully by South Africa.
Okay, well, it's a reasonably positive note to end it on then. Thanks very much for joining us, Melita, and maybe we'll catch up with you later in the week. Thank you.
Thanks very much for inviting me.